Uh, Amanda mentioned, I am an associate producer at Tenderfoot TV in Atlanta. I'm also a trained forensic interviewer. She gave you a little bit of my background. I wanted to kind of go back and explain how I got into the field of forensic interviewing. I started as a victim advocate in 2013, and then in 2014, I completed the training to be a forensic interviewer. I worked as a victim advocate and sexual assault response team coordinator. And then in 2018, I started conducting interviews at the advocacy center where I had worked as an advocate. To date, I've conducted over 400 forensic interviews and I've testified in court as an expert witness. And I share my background because I hope that helps to understand why this is important to me. I think that trauma-informed interviewing is the right way to interview someone because we do speak to people that have experienced unthinkable things in the world of podcasting and true crime. So a lot of people don't know what a forensic interview is. A forensic interview is a semi-structured conversation in which the trained interviewer speaks to a child or developmentally disabled adult who has experienced or witnessed physical abuse, sexual abuse, or homicide. I think a lot of people don't have an understanding of what a forensic interview is because in the media we see detectives conducting those interviews. And while that does happen with adult survivors, often with children or disabled adults, most places believe it's best practice to have a trained interviewer interview them. And so that's what I do. And an interviewer is an unbiased third party. So I'm gathering facts and information for the purpose of a criminal investigation. And so when my worlds collided and I entered the world of podcasting in 2019, I really immediately realized like I did not want to leave behind my training and experience. I wanted to bring that into my role as an associate producer. And I try my best to do that at all times. And that's kind of what I'm sharing with you guys today is how we can conduct trauma-informed interviewing for true crime podcasts. So we will get started. So just a brief agenda, we'll define some terms first, and then go over the 6 guiding principles of a trauma-informed approach. We'll examine the why, because in podcasting, you don't have to use a trauma-informed approach, right? You can approach an interview any way that you want. And I kind of want to discuss a little bit why I feel this is important. We'll also talk about pre-interview preparation. So before you even reach out to that individual and ask them to interview with you, what are some things that you can do to prepare for that ask? We'll go over the trauma-informed interviewing do's, trauma-informed interviewing don'ts, and then post-interview follow-up. Just how do you follow up with that individual once you have the interview that you need to ensure that you've left them, in the best way possible and just see if they need any additional support. So defining the terms, we hear the word trauma a lot today. I mean, definitely much more than we did say 20 years ago. But I think it's important to understand that while we hear the word trauma, we don't often understand what trauma is and its impact on individuals. Trauma impacts the body, mind, memory. The ability to retell a story is impacted by your trauma that you may have experienced. When we talk to someone who's experienced trauma, it's also important to remember that that individual is not the only person who experienced trauma. Sometimes there's a caregiver who's also experienced trauma or surviving sibling or even a witness. So this definition of trauma is an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. As I tried to think of a definition for trauma-informed interviewing, I Googled, and I couldn't find something specific for podcasting. And so I kind of thought, what do I think trauma-informed interviewing for podcasting is? And so what I came up with is the interviewer takes the appropriate steps to implement strategies to reduce the likelihood of re-traumatizing the victim or survivor. And re-traumatizing someone is obviously they're going to experience the trauma again, often when they tell the story, but that how do we just reduce that likelihood by taking necessary steps? And in podcasting, we don't have, like a journalist code of ethics per se. But it is important to know these, I think, because I know for us at Tenderfoot, we do often partner with journalists to host our podcast or to work with them. And as I looked at the definition for their code of ethics, I thought that it was interesting because it does speak about, minimizing harm. Ethical journalism strives to ensure the free exchange of information that is accurate, fair, and thorough. An ethical journalist acts with integrity, and their four principles are seek truth and report it, minimize harm, which again to me is emphasizes the importance of being trauma informed, act independently, be accountable and transparent. And I've used the term best practices a couple of times. Best practices is a professional procedure that are accepted or prescribed as being correct or most effective. And so if I use that term, that's what I'm referring to in podcasting, kind of how do we develop best practices when interviewing victims. And so the trauma-informed approach is an approach that is implemented in the medical field, in social work, even in schools with teachers. And so what these are guiding principles on how to engage with someone who has experienced trauma. And what I like about these guiding principles, you might see them vary depending on where you find them, but they all have some shared components. So first, safety. And what does that look like in podcasting? We create a safe environment for someone to share their story. Trustworthy and transparency. When we tell someone what our podcast is about and we want them to tell their story, we just want to be transparent. We don't need someone's permission to share their story. That's the reality in podcasting. 10 people can tell the same story. To me, it's important that I build trust with that individual because they're sharing something that's very difficult to share and it's important to them. Peer support. I think organizations like the Podcast Academy are amazing, right? Because if you're in a situation where you're constantly talking to someone else about trauma, if you've experienced any trauma yourself, you could actually be in need of additional support. So if we're constantly speaking to someone about their most difficult moments and we're survivors or someone we know is a survivor, it might be important to reach out for that peer support to ensure that we are well when we're conducting these interviews. Collaboration. So with collaboration, I want to emphasize that this does not mean that we are telling the individual, you tell us how you want us to tell your story, right? Because that's not always going to happen. What collaboration means is we're talking about their story and we're understanding the important points of their story and working together, partnering to tell it in the best way that we can. Empowerment, voice, and choice. We'll talk about this a little bit later. It's really important to allow someone to tell their story and give them the choice of whether or not there are certain parts of their story that they don't want to share. If they trust you with the story and they say, please leave this out, then we want to be leaving that part of the interview out. And another thing is while it could re-traumatize someone to tell their story, it's really important to remember too, it can empower someone to tell their story. If someone has survived a traumatic event and you give them the opportunity to tell their story, sometimes they'll come back and say, you know what, I really didn't realize that telling my story was something that I needed to do. So allowing someone to tell their story is a wonderful thing. We can actually help empower them. And then cultural, historical, and gender issues. Part of what we do may put us in situations where we are speaking to people who don't look like us, who don't practice the same religion as us. So we have to do our part to do the research and to be aware of any of our hidden biases, right? That's important. Are there things about us that when we engage with that person could cause more trauma because we didn't take the time to understand their culture, their experience? And so podcasters are not providing trauma-informed care, right? We're interviewing trauma survivors. So why should we even care about these guiding principles? Why are they important? And we will go over that next. So ethics. I'm, of course, going to say I think it's the ethical thing to do. As I mentioned, we can tell anyone's story. I think that we don't need their permission, but if they grant it to us, then we want to make sure that we're doing the ethical thing, which is to share their story the way that they told it, not retell it. And I also think that it builds up the industry, to be honest with you, the integrity of the industry. Avoid ethical dilemmas. It reduces the likelihood that you'll be in a situation where you have to look back and think, was that the right thing to do? Because from the beginning, you've looked at this and you've thought about that other individual. You've heard their story and you have, applied all of those things so that you're able to reduce that likelihood of the ethical dilemma. Reduce liability. The reality is that, you are open for lawsuits in this field. I mean, and so you can't always say that's not going to happen, but what you can do is say, okay, I've told the story as it was told to me. I have been honest and truthful. I've been ethical and I've acted with integrity. And so that could reduce liability. And not everyone's in podcasting for, money, but a lot of people do want to monetize their podcast. Some advertisers won't care how you've shared a story, or they won't care about how you've behaved. I do believe that a lot of what we see today in the world shows you that advertisers do care. Cancel culture is a real thing. So to me, when we're putting out a product, it's important that we're putting out something that I'm proud to stand behind. And then for those of you who don't know, the TPA does have a code of conduct. It's really a great way to check yourself and say, is what I'm presenting, is what I'm doing in line with that code of conduct. So there's a couple of questions that I'll go ahead and take as we go. I actually like taking questions as I go because I don't want you to feel like I'm talking to you. And so here's one of the questions. I wish we had a code of ethics for podcasting. That's a statement. I actually agree with that, obviously. And I think that it's important, if we think that, how do we get that, developed? Someone else asked, is forensic interview training available to anyone? Great question. Forensic interview training is not available to anyone. I have a super non-traditional path in this field. I started as a volunteer, as I mentioned, and then was going to grad school. And what happened was forensic interview training became open through a nonprofit and a grant. And my employer would only pay for forensic interview training if I was employed full time. And at that time in my life, that was not a fit for me. And so I was really lucky I got a grant to attend the training. It's a week-long training at the Georgia Public Safety Training Center. I trained alongside some amazing detectives and district attorney and different people. And so while it's not available to everyone, at least in Georgia, I don't know if where everyone is, but it's not available. But there are a lot of great trainings or information online that can help you understand what a forensic interview is. Okay, so yes, feel free to put questions in the chat. So how do I prepare for an interview? I conduct thorough research and I know the facts as best I can. And when I say as best I can, I say that because internet is not always right. So I conduct as much research as I can with concrete documents as well as Google. Be cognizant of when you contact the interviewee. I'm the kind of person that really kind of thinks through that, right? This person I'm going to call out of the blue and ask them to interview with me. I don't want to call them at 8 o'clock in the morning if they're getting their kids off to school. I don't want to call them at 1 in the afternoon if they're at work, especially if it's a situation where either it's a really old case and just the call is jolting, or it's a situation where it's a really new case and maybe 50 other people are calling them to interview. I think through all of that. I've had calls with people oftentimes in the evening because that works better for them. And so think about when you're going to call them for the interview. Introduce yourself, be kind, and share basic details of the project. And I say that because People, especially if it's a big story, how many people have reached out to them, right? And they're looking at you as someone else who wants their story. So I'm going to share the basic details of the project. Someone asked me the other day, do you have to share, you know, everything about your project? No, but I think in sharing the important parts of it, we are telling the story of, for example, the Atlanta child murders. We were told that your sibling was a victim. Would you be interested to, speaking about that? So I don't have to give all the details of the project, but what I'm comfortable sharing and what I think they would need to know to make that decision. Answer questions about the project. So once you've given those basic details, if they have additional questions about what you're doing, be transparent, be open. And I think that's important because when we have in mind what the podcast is going to sound like, and then this person's story that we hear could completely change that. Are we going to be willing to tell their story, or is what we want to tell going to be more important? So they might ask you, how are you going to approach that? Are you going to say he's innocent, he's guilty? Answer those questions as best you can. And sometimes you might say, we're just trying to see where this show podcast is going to take us. We're not sure yet. That's an okay answer too. Give them an option to think about it and get back to you. I think that's really important because if in our mind, we're thinking, I really need to secure this interview, but that person may not be ready to give you a yes or a no. And so give them that time. If they say no, accept no and provide your contact information. And I did want to share a brief story about that. So one of the projects I'm working on right now is really old. So I'm reaching out to people who haven't spoke about their tragedy and trauma for many, many years. And so when I reached out to one sister, she was sister of the victim. She was really open to it. And she said, well, here's my other sister's number. I don't think she's going to be open to it. So when I called, she yelled, she screamed, I'm not going to talk to you. And I said, I'm so sorry. I can only imagine how difficult this is. Can I give you my phone number in case you change your mind? And she did take down my phone number, and some time went by and she actually called me back and we were able to have a conversation about her no. And what was interesting to me is she said, all of these people have told my sister's story. They've all told it wrong. And I asked her, what did they get wrong? The reason that was important to me was because whatever they got wrong, I did not want to get wrong. And I gave her the opportunity to be heard. And we had a few more phone calls. And then she did sit down and interview with me. And when I tell you, it does not matter how much time goes by, her pain, it just unleashed during that interview. And it was, this case is older than me. And so it was one of those situations where she needed time to think about it. So if they say yes, discuss the interview guidelines. How do you want me to refer to you? Some people do not want to be called a victim. They want to be called a survivor. Some people want to be called something else. How do I identify you? What do you want me to call you? Are there any guidelines, anything off limits that we will not talk about? Discuss that once they give you that yes. Inquire about the interview setting, day, and time. When I tell you we have conducted interviews all over to meet the needs of whoever we're interviewing. Sometimes people are traveling. My biggest accomplishment regarding securing an interview was having someone interview in Afghanistan when they were traveling, and we had to use a translator to book the interview. Crazy, but that's what that person needed in order to interview with us. Follow up with an email to confirm the interview. So for us, we often follow up with the interview with all of the details, including the interview setting, day, and time, and then maybe information on who's going to be contacting them for the audio part. So, you might hear from our sound engineer to make sure, if in case we have to send you a mic or do this or do that. So that's putting them in touch with that third party so that they know who's going to contact them versus them just hearing from some random person that they don't know. So Steph asked if it's ethical for people to sign a consent. We always get consents for our projects. Sometimes it depends on who we're partnering with. When we are partnering, what that consent looks like. So we have written consents, and then we also have times when we're starting the interview and you just say to the individual, so I just want to make sure that I have your consent to record and that you understand that this interview is going to be used for a podcast. So we do use consents. What do you do post-interview for self-care to ensure you and the project are not absorbing the trauma of the interviewee? That is a really great question. And I think that applies also to the forensic interview work that I do. I'm a big fan of self-care. And honestly, I think with podcasting, people forget that we are hearing terrible things sometimes, right? So for me, what self-care looks like is putting down my phone and not answering emails. I'm kind of compulsive about emails, especially work. Um, my husband's great about letting me talk about things that are cases. I think sometimes he knows the details as much as I do. But if I start to get into where it's a daily conversation about a case that's really close to my heart, he'll remind me, like, let's go hiking or let's do something different. So having people around you that keep you in check is important too, because these cases can consume you. If you're looking at old cases, sometimes too, I mean, I have thousands of documents right now I'm going through for an old case. And I'm one of those people that once I dig in, sometimes I just really dig in. So being aware, having something that's your escape, putting down your phone, if your emails go to your phone, protect your well-being. So you get to the day of the interview, right? And so this is similar to a structure that we would use in a forensic interview, but it's not the exact structure because a podcast interview is not a forensic interview. One thing I think is really important to the forensic interview protocol, as well as in a podcast protocol, is to build rapport in the beginning. This person is nervous. Even if you spoke with them pre-interview, remember, pre-interview is to go over guidelines and talk to them. You don't want to ask their story in the pre-interview. You want to just let them know this is what I think I want to interview you for, anything I've missed, anything I should add. You're going to get that story during the interview. So rapport build with them. Oh, okay, how's your day? We're going to just talk and make sure we got good sound. And how are you feeling? I think that's really important to just calm down the individual and prepare them for the interview. Provide reminders of the interview guidelines, whatever you talked about in your pre-call. I know you don't want to talk about this. I will remember that. Is there anything else you want me to remember? I want you to speak in a narrative response. And that's just having someone tell their story beginning to end. And just let them know whatever those guidelines are that you have for the interview. Then you transition to the interview using open-ended questions that elicit a narrative response. So what that means is the questions are open-ended. So introduce yourself. They're going to introduce themselves. So tell me what happened on the day your sister went missing from beginning to end. And you are going to actively listen. Active listening is conveyed through eye contact, body language, tone of voice, and your interest. It's important to look at someone when they're telling their story, not staring at them to when, they feel uncomfortable, but making that eye contact when necessary. Our body language communicates a lot of things. Forensic interviews are audio and video recorded, and we do monthly peer reviews, and body language is an important part of it. If I'm turned away, if my arms are crossed, if I take deep breaths, all of those things could be viewed as me being impatient or, like, okay, come on, I've heard enough. And so be aware of our body language when we're actively listening. Pay attention to their tone of voice, body language, gestures, and eye contact, because that might tell you that they need a moment. You're going to learn a lot from those things. During COVID, most of our interviews were conducted via Zoom. And so I learned that you can actually learn a lot about people, even through a Zoom interview. Let them tell their entire story without interruption. I think that we tend to want to interject when people are talking, but when someone is speaking from a place of pain, it's really important to let them speak, beginning to end. I'm a huge fan of note-taking. And some people might think, well, how are you going to note take and make eye contact? That could be in those interview guidelines beforehand. I want you to know I'm listening. I'm going to jot down some notes for things I might want to circle back to. And so I always have a piece of paper and I can look and just jot down don't forget that, don't forget that. And those notes are valuable when you go back and want some clarification. Allow silence. I will tell you, for me, that was the hardest thing in forensic interviewing. Silence is awkward. 15 seconds feels like 15 hours. But silence gives people the opportunity to breathe and to honestly think about what they're going to say next. And sometimes what comes out of that silence are really powerful moments for the person as well as for your podcast. Circle back to clarify. As I mentioned, when they've told their whole story, you want to gather information that you didn't get from their story to help you increase understanding. Or sometimes you want to gather more sensory information, right? You might want to say something like, you mentioned that when you were running away, you were really scared. Tell me what that was like. And they might then share their actual experience about their body, what they felt physically, what they felt inside. So we're going to go back and clarify the information that they gave us. At the end of the interview, always ask, is there anything I missed or that you would like our listeners to know? I actually love that question because you get answers or statements that you never intended to get. A story, a young lady said to me one time in an interview is that people think they know what this is like, but they don't know. Those are just huge moments where I can't understand what she's going through. Even if I did experience trauma in my life, it's not the same trauma she went through. And ask, how do you handle it when a person becomes emotional? Do you ever feel the need to console? Oh, absolutely. Yes, that's fine. Remember, the beauty in podcasting is we can cut things, right? We can move things around. So you can absolutely console someone. So what is important in those moments when I say allow silence is, we're going to let them, we're not going to say, and what happened next in that moment, right? But what we might do when we're allowing that silence, if we see them get a real emotional, say, it's okay, take a moment, it's all right. I've even said to somebody, we will not use this, it's all right, because she was very emotional in that moment. So it's fine to console someone in those moments. In forensic interviewing, you're an unbiased party in a child forensic interview, so a different setting. So we've learned to sit in very uncomfortable silence, and we can say something maybe like, there's tissue to your left, or take a moment, but it's different because you're not saying, I'm so sorry that happened to you. In podcasting, you can say all of those things. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Do you need a moment? Is there anything I can do? Would you like to finish today if they're really emotional, or would you like us to try this another day? Give them that option. That goes back to that empowering the individual. Closure. How many times can we prod before it's too much? So I think that really is a personal question, because you are in that interview and all the things you've talked to that person about. So when you ask about how much you should prod, I think that's why you let them tell the whole narrative. So you're getting a lot of information, and then you're saying, I just want to go back and make sure I understand what happened that day. And then if they finally say something like, well, I've already told you that, then they've had enough, So you're wanting to get also a true response from them. So not asking the same question too many times is important. So it's not really a number, I guess, of how many times, like a number, but just what you're comfortable with. And again, you'll get that feeling, I think, from the individual. And I did see the question said, what about circling back? I would not circle back to something, in my personal opinion, more than 2, max 3 times. And the only reason I would probably do it a third time is if I really didn't understand something, because circling back is making sure I understood what you said, and clarifying terms, making sure I know what happened that day. So really 2 times you're going to get that answer from them. So I hope that answered your question. Feel free to type another one if it didn't. So trauma-informed interview don'ts. Don't jump into the interview without going over the guidelines. Don't interrupt. We had a situation where, we had someone that was going on and on and on and on and on. And then I thought, okay, now I just want to make sure I know what part of where we are in the story. And so then I said, I just want to make sure really quick, are we talking about that first day, that second day, or something else? And so interrupting is, I'm not saying never, but we try not to interrupt, especially when someone is what we call in forensic interviewing, actively disclosing their trauma, because interjecting actually, they could feel disrespected. They could be, struggle with, oh, they're not hearing me or actively listening to me. Don't rush. Please allow enough time. If you're scheduling an interview with someone and they're telling you their trauma, do not schedule a 30-minute interview and say, okay, let's go. And then you've got to take, your child somewhere in 45 minutes or, cook dinner in 45 minutes, because we can work from anywhere in podcasting, right? That's a reality, especially during COVID. I would chunk out 2 hours for an interview. Now, I would schedule it for one. And at the 1 hour mark, I would say to the individual, I want to respect your time. Would you like to continue or would you like us to stop? So that was more me, again, giving them the opportunity to be empowered to say they wanted to continue or they didn't. Don't primarily focus on the story that you want. Let's be honest. We're reaching out to somebody because we know the story we want to tell. We want to tell the story of the serial killer and their sister was a survivor, right? But if you let them tell you their true story, sometimes you're going to actually get way more than you ever hope to get out of that story, because you only know what you think you know. You don't know their true experience that day. Don't put words in their mouth or structure questions to get the response you want. So that is something that is a pet peeve of mine, actually, is that when someone says, so I read that you were super angry about this, and I saw on this, chat that you were mad, so tell me about being mad. Like, let them tell you that they were mad, then ask them about being mad. And we've had people, situations where, you know something or you think you know something. So I'm trying to cautiously say this. You think you know something, but at the end of the day, you don't always know the full story. Like the person I interviewed who said to me, this is what that person got wrong. I would have got that wrong too, because had I Googled, the information that the other person had asked her was on Google. So again, I don't want to assume I know everything and structure my questions to get a specific story. I want to hear their story. Don't push or ignore signs that the interviewee may need a break, a second interview, or to stop. You don't use questions that assign blame, especially for survivors. Why didn't you do this? Why did you do that? You can reframe those like, tell me about what happened after the incident. So then you're going to get maybe why they did something or didn't do something. Those questions, the tell me, why, we actually try to ask as few W questions in a forensic interview as possible. It is a challenge, but there's a reason for that. Sometimes people feel blamed when the W questions are asked. Do not abruptly end the interview. That goes back to allowing enough time. If we don't allow enough time, then our clock is ticking while someone is telling their story, and we might abruptly end that interview, and that does a disservice to that individual, and it leaves them kind of in a state of, their trauma that they're reliving, and we're like, oh, sorry, I've got to go. A question: what do you do when a potential interviewee is open to speak with you until they see the appearance release and change their minds or get weary? What do you do to help them feel comfortable? So if someone agrees to interview with me and then they see something that changes their mind, I would want to have a call about that and find out what factors have influenced them changing their mind. I would ask them, what can we do to make you more comfortable by interviewing with us? There's a reason that person, changed their mind. And you can help them feel comfortable by, again, empowering them and seeing what they need to feel comfortable or why they're reluctant to tell their story. As I mentioned with the story that we're working on now, that's a really old case, the person I interviewed had never told her children about this trauma. So this person had kept this bottled up all those years. So, of course, for her to feel comfortable, she needed a lot of questions answered before she was going to speak with me. And she also needed time to speak to her loved ones about her decision. What if the person gets really off topic and goes on, and let's say the interview has been like 2 hours? Can you interrupt? Yes. And that's where I was saying, like, if you, that's when you see the interview just going all over the place. And then you say to them, okay, I want to make sure I'm getting all of the story that you wanted me to get, and that I want to make, the questions I was going to ask you. So let's go back and talk about day one and talk about day two. And I'll tell you, I'm sharing this information with you guys, and I still make these mistakes. I'm not an expert. I just conducted an interview and had to be on a flight. I almost missed my flight because I interviewed somebody who was very long-winded, and I did not gauge that in the pre-interview. And so finally, I did have to say, I would love to do a follow-up interview with you. I'm sorry I didn't allot enough time, and let's chat when I get back to Atlanta. And so we're scheduling a Zoom interview. And so again, I share this with you, but there are times when you even leave an hour and a half and you need to end that interview. So it's doing that respectfully if you do have to, and sharing, I want to make sure I'm respecting your time. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by talking about this too long. Showing that you care about them, and then also respecting time of whoever's involved. Sometimes on our calls, it's not just me and the person I'm interviewing. It might be someone else that's our sound engineer. So we're respecting everyone's time with that interview. So post-interview follow-up. This is really important to me. I always thank the people that I interview with. I thank them with an email. I've even mailed a card. I mean, every interview is going to be different. You're not always going to mail a card. I've had a few that have touched my heart to the point that I did mail a card. I've had people I've interviewed that I have kept in touch with, obviously let them know when the project's coming out. But even one family, I provided them with an update that I received that was really interesting from one of the FBI agents that we spoke to. So I do believe it's okay to follow up with them if they're comfortable with it. Offer resources if requested. So you might be talking to someone and they get super, super emotional. And if you ask them, have you been able to talk to anyone about your experience? If they say no, offer to find them some resources. That's not always going to be something that they want, but there's a lot of support groups out there, and it can take you seriously, a 5-minute Google to find someone's support in their area. So I encourage you that if you feel that the person would benefit from that, or if they tell you that they are in need of resources, that you go ahead and find those and share them. And then share the project when it's released. That can be via an email, or, if you've communicated via text, let them know that the project is coming out. Again, we go back to what I said earlier. You're not making a podcast that someone else wants you to make. And even if you've done all these things, there might be someone that's not happy with the end result, right? That could happen. But I do still think it's important to share the project with the individuals who have taken the time to interview with you, so that they hear the final project if they want to listen to it, and that they can share with other people if they would like to. And so I talked a little bit about resources. I went ahead and looked up some resources that I know are well-respected resources in the social work world. RAIN is an organization that supports sexual assault survivors. They also provide resources for survivors' family members. For example, the advocacy center that I work at part-time, our phone number can be found on that RAIN website. Partnership Against Domestic Violence, if someone shares that they're a survivor of domestic violence, or that's what your podcast is about, provide them with their information. They have a lot of great information on their website. And again, I mentioned those support groups. There's homicide survivors group. There's groups for parents who've lost children. There's groups for siblings and other survivors. I know it sounds like I'm asking you to do something above and beyond what podcasting is, but honestly, if you create a list, it's really easy to share. Something that Amanda and I spoke about is even having a list available through the TPA so people can quickly access it and send it if someone needs it. Lifeline suicide prevention, they have a text option as well as a phone option. And then the National Association for Mental Health, that NAMI is a great organization with free counseling options, peer support groups. And we talked about that early on when I mentioned how peer support is important to podcasters. Peer support is also important for survivors. And so if someone doesn't want to speak to a therapist or can't afford to speak to a therapist, peer support can be really important to those individuals. And then Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association, that is a great organization that provides free and low cost support to substance abuse survivors, as well as people that have mental health struggles. Yes, Steph, we are definitely working. She mentioned that she would love if we could create a resource list, when to have a content trigger warning in an episode, where in the episode, and what is considered useful info to include. I think that would be great. And we did speak about that. How can we, equip podcasters that are in the TPA or involved in the TPA so that you do have these resources available to you? I know that the work we do is not easy work. I think that people sometimes don't realize that it is difficult work to do. And we can all work together so that we can produce really great true crime podcasts while also ensuring that we're respecting the victim and their story. And so I kind of answered questions as I went along. I wanted to finish at 7:45 and at 7:46 so that I had time to go back and answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much, Jamie. This is incredible. I feel like there's 3 open here, so I'll let you continue on. That was fast. Great, everybody.
I know I was so afraid that I wouldn't leave enough time for questions. So I'm glad that I did. And so Steph says that as someone who is a PTSD survivor in a company of awesome podcasters, she would love to be involved in any of this. So I think that's great. I think that someone mentioned earlier, we wish we had a code of ethics or different things like that. It all starts with us, right? Saying what is important to us as we make podcasts. And as I want to make sure I stress that this is not, Tenderfoot TV policies and procedures. We all have different styles. Everyone develops their own style. And there's not a right or a wrong. For me, with my background, as I entered this world, it was just so important to me. I did not want to leave that behind. I thought that, as I tell people stories, I wanted to give them the same respect and support as I do when I conduct forensic interviews, as much as I could. Once the episode is published, how do you handle the feedback if it's negative? Well, at the end of the day, we cannot control how our project is received. And I think that's when we go back to the integrity and ethics piece. For me, when a project comes out, I just want to know that at the end of the day, I can say that I did my best to put out the truth and to produce this episode or this this 12 and these 12 episodes. And everyone is not going to agree with you. Everyone is not going to think you even did a good job, but it's about you knowing that you've done that. And that's why I'm a big fan of having policies that I adhere to so that I know that and I feel good about the work that I do. If an interviewee asks to hear the project before it's released, would you consider sending it to them beforehand so they can hear it? Let me speak for myself. I would probably say no. And the reason I say no is because once I share that episode, I don't know who else it's going to be shared with. And so I want to keep that in-house until we have, got all of our ducks in a row and it's going to be out and be released. And I don't know, how you guys feel about that, but I would not share an entire, episode or series with someone that I've interviewed, because what if I do that and then they say, I don't like that part, please remove me from the podcast. The reality is we are in the business of producing podcasts, right? As I said earlier, I'm not expecting everyone to be trauma informed or do things my way. I just want to share how you can be trauma informed and still produce podcasts. We published a podcast, and a Facebook group thinks that they know who committed the crime. And it is someone that we interviewed. They're upset about it and have created a group of people to leave negative reviews. Have you experienced that? Any tips? So I would have to actually probably defer to someone on our team as far as people creating extra groups and things like that after a show, because I have not personally experienced that. Our most recent project, the MLK tapes, took 2 years to put out. And I remember thinking, I don't know what the feedback is going to be. Everybody thinks they know what happened to MLK. Everybody has an opinion. How's the family going to feel? I thought of all these things. And actually, the podcast was very well received. So sometimes we might overthink too, right? And we might have a really warm response from the podcast in the sense of people leaving negative reviews. I'm sure that happens all the time that are not genuine reviews, not just from people that don't like your show, but maybe it's someone who's a competitor, I don't know. So I would say for you to continue to do work with integrity and share your podcasts. And that's really all that you can do, because you never know the reason that someone is upset or why they're sharing that, negative review. So as long as you're putting out good work, that's all that you can do. And how someone receives it, just never know.
Jaime, I'm
Anything
just so
else?
impressed by all your amazing responses and how thoughtful your approach has been. I think that just the more, when I listen to Atlanta Monster and the other Tenderfoot TV True Crime podcasts, as I shared with you, I really could hear the tells that somebody with your lens had advised on those. Lots of really great questions to the audience. Is there anything you would like to make sure folks come out of part one really remembering and holding on to based on your talking points?
Sure. Again, thank you so much for having me lead this training. I really think that podcasting is such an amazing medium to tell someone's story. It's just an amazing opportunity. And I think that if someone allows you into their space to tell their story, it's an honor and a privilege to do so. And so the do's and don'ts that I gave, for example, are not written in stone. You have to come up with what works for you, what works for the company you work for, if you work for a company, and then figure out what your style is in interviewing and producing your podcast. The other thing that I think is important for people to know is, there isn't a right or wrong. I think that just because I'm forensic interview trained, I do see things from a different lens, right? But that doesn't mean that your way of doing things is not a great way to gather that story and put together a project. I love that so many people here have said that they would like a resource list, because together is how we, can be sure that we're working with people and that we're hearing their stories. So I'm happy to work on that as well. And yeah, that's really all I have. I'm super glad you all attended today, and I'm available for you guys to reach out via email after this if you have any questions, or if you have any projects that you're working on and you would like me to kind of give you feedback on how I would approach, calling someone or try to secure the interview. And to be honest, I still get anxiety sometimes when I have to reach out to someone. Like I said, if it's a really old case, or if I know that they've never interviewed before, you can look up a story and see like that sibling's never interviewed. That is something that can be nerve-wracking. And so that's why I'm hoping that with some of these guidelines, it can reduce your anxiety and help you secure the interview and put out a really good product.
Wonderful advice. And you're getting a lot of gratitude in the chat. Clearly there's such a need, Jaime. And I really also wanted to mention that we have so much knowledge that you can share. And a lot of people had questions that kind of lead into part two and May 4th. So I shared in the chat that on May 4th, you're going to follow up and we're going to talk a bit about post-production and maybe explore a bit more about those questions that people had about the impact of the medium after their story has been shared. Is there anything else that you wanted to make sure that our participants, hopefully these folks will be joining us then, can know about that besides the general outline I just shared?
No, and I think that it's it'll be similar in that, we want to respect their story and things like that. But post-production sometimes too, you've gathered the interview and then there's other people involved in the process, right? And so everyone may not want to put out a product that's exactly the same as yours. And I'm not saying that's an issue that we have on our team, but we partner with people and, there's different things that come up. And so when you look at post-production, there's, I feel like, a lot more people involved in the process. And so how do we get them on board to understand whatever you communicated to the person you interviewed in pre-production? So that's it.
Excellent. Excellent. And Guillermo had just shared, this is one of the best interviews, lots of gold nuggets of wisdom and just really fantastic interviewing techniques shared, Jaime. I just want to welcome everybody to share your continued conversation in the TPA Slack. And as Jaime mentioned, there's the code of conduct. That's a great place to start. We have so many other resources, and I'm loving the suggestion, as you had helped name, Jaime, of the need for a follow-up resource sheet that you can always send to people after you've interviewed. So we do have one in progress, and I'm glad to see some folks want to get involved. And Jaime, of course, will continue working on that and iterating as well. I think if there's no other questions from our audience, this has been an absolutely illuminating and incredibly important webinar from our TPA Masterclass series, Jaime. I just want to thank you again so much for everything you do. And to echo what you had said earlier, that's very profound to me, is that the storytelling can be a modality of healing. And it's really the care that you bring to it that helps keep it on that path for people who sometimes it's the first time they've talked about it, you had mentioned.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I wanted to thank you all again for joining us. It's just been great. I'm going to stop the recording. I'll stick around for any quick questions about TPA, but in general, please do complete the exit survey. Jaime, thank you so much for being here, and everybody have a really wonderful evening.
Yep. Thank you. Good night.